A very small town in the state of Indiana. Growing up with film taught you to really think it out right there on the spot because you couldn't fix it in Photoshop. But as the internet took off, more and more advertising dollars went into the internet and the web and not to print. And when that happened, a lot of publications went by the wayside. When I started out, we would be fired from the newspaper if we set up or manipulated a photograph. AI has taken that to a whole different extreme. The irony of that is that every time you point your camera at something, you're just seeing this much. So what is the truth? What's right over here that's not in the frame, or what's right over here that's not in the frame? Even a real honest picture has the potential to lie. It's a great question. Unfortunately, it's much tougher to earn a living with photography today. Artificial intelligence will increase that difficulty, unfortunately. Making mistakes is the best teacher. The more mistakes I made, the more I learned, and I'm still making mistakes. There's great stories right in your backyard.
Welcome to Shutter Talk, the podcast that takes you behind the lens and explores the world of photography. In each episode, we delve into the lives and stories of renowned photographers. Today, I am thrilled to have the opportunity to sit down with the extraordinary Scott Goldsmith, whose career has been a breathtaking journey through the power of imagery.
Hi, I'm Scott Goldsmith. I'm based in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. I'm a photojournalist.
In this interview, we dive deep into Scott's life and career, uncovering the stories behind his most cherished photographs, the moments that defined his artistic journey, and the insights gained from his unique perspective.
A multitude of national publications, Sports Illustrated, National Geographic, People, Time. I was on the staff of a magazine called U.S. News and World Report. I've worked on some personal projects that I think are meaningful during that time. I've maintained my relationship with some other other companies that like a photojournalistic approach. So it's been a good mix, it's been a good ride.
Whether you're an aspiring photographer, a seasoned professional, or simply someone with an appreciation for the art of storytelling through images, Shutter Talk promises to inspire, educate, and ignite your passion for photography. So, without further ado, let's welcome Scott Goldsmith to the show and dive deep into the world behind his extraordinary lens. I think the best place to start would be chronologically. What was life like growing up?
Yeah, thanks. I grew up in a very small town in the state of Indiana, and I loved it there. It was very rural. We lived in the country, and from our house, you couldn't see any other houses. It was just a cornfield in the distant front and a meadow on the left, and then a woods on the right, and I played in the woods a lot. It was basketball was almost like a religion in Indiana, so I played a lot of basketball. And my dad gave me his Sears single lens reflex camera when I was about 9 or 10 years old, and I never put it down. It seemed like I just fell in love with it and the magic that it brought, and I would photograph a lot of different things on our vacations, but just right around the house, family, the natural world, which I've continued to fall in love with forever. And I went to high school there. And after that, I went to Indiana University, which is in Southern Indiana. And that's when I realized that photojournalism was a passion. At my sophomore year, I met an incredible professor by the name of Will Counts. And they had a great journalism program there, but more importantly, they had a great photojournalism program there that was doing wonderful things. Will was great, and those next 3 years were incredibly significant in my future as a photographer. So I learned a lot there. I had photo internships at different newspapers during the summers. I worked in Muskegon, Michigan, Fort Wayne, Indiana, and Louisville, Kentucky. And I still to this day find that making mistakes is the best teacher. The more mistakes I made, the more I learned, and I'm still making mistakes. But in my earlier years at the newspaper, I'd make tons of mistakes, but I hopefully only made those mistakes one time. So I always tell younger photographers, work a lot because you're going to make more mistakes and you'll learn more.
You have won too many awards to count, but there is one in particular that stands out. Your photographic odyssey began when you received an award of College Photographer of the Year in the Hearst Competition, catapulting you into the spotlight. Do you remember what photo that award was for and the story behind that photo?
Sure. Well, it wasn't one photo. They judged you on a body of work because, and I think that's smart because anybody can come up with a good, not anybody, but one photo might be lucky. So they judge you on a body of work. Two entities of that body need to be photo stories, photo essays, and the rest are what they call single images representing different categories, which would hopefully show a little bit of your breadth and depth as a photographer. Um, so all the colleges around the United States enter this contest. They have a pre-screening at the college. Where Indiana, we had a judging, and then they selected two entries from our college to be submitted into the Hearst competition. The Hearst offices were in San Francisco. They still are. And from that judging of all the colleges around the country, they picked the top three. I was lucky enough to be one of those three. And it was the first year they flew us to San Francisco for what they called a shoot off, which was not only fun, but it was a huge challenge. We It was one guy from the University of Missouri, Louis Sohoyas, great photographer, great person, and Bill Wax, a fantastic photographer from Florida. We met out there, and on the day of what they call the shoot off, we went to breakfast with Bob Gilka in the hotel, and he had two rolls of film at each plate, two rolls of Tri-X film. And that was all we had for about an 8-hour shoot. Our assignment was Fisherman's Wharf, which is a famous part of San Francisco. And we set out to tell our story of Fisherman's Wharf. And, I worked probably as hard as they did. I think that any of us three could have won the award. I feel extremely honored to have come in first place and have great gratitude for those people that were involved in the contest.
So after you leave college, what was your route from there?
So after college, I got hired by the Louisville Courier-Journal. I think part of it was they had already tested me out. I worked there as an intern, and I loved the people there, and I guess they probably liked me okay. And so I started working there with these great photographers, and the best thing about that newspaper experience were there were incredible photo editors there. Cheryl Magazine and Dennis Demick, who later went on to become the director of photography at the National Geographic. Just phenomenal people and phenomenal photographers. And one of the wonderful things about that photo staff was that we would help each other at the light table. We were shooting film, obviously, then. And so we would help each other edit our contact sheets. And that insight from other great photographers was a big foundation for me moving forward. They would point out my mistakes and my successes, and it really, really, really helped me going forward. So after I had worked in Louisville, and by the way, at a newspaper, and I still think it's a great way to start out, you shoot sports and fashion and feature and news and illustrations and hard news, soft news, and just pretty weather pictures or whatever. That broad scope helps you make more mistakes. So helps you learn. Fortunately, our director of photography at the time, Tom Harden, encouraged us to play with medium format and large format and different lighting. So it was an incredible training ground to later become a freelancer. That was a great launching pad. So I went from Louisville to Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. I had two great friends here that welcomed me into their house for the first year I was here, Melissa Farlow and Randy Olson. And the ability to stay with them helped me get my career off to a start here, because when you first start out freelancing, you're making very little money. So after 1 year, I had enough to put a down payment on a house and branch out on my own career.
When you started as a photographer, photography was all about print. How has that shift from print to online affected your photography? And what does that shift mean practically, technically, and artistically?
Um, so there's two different categories of how it changed. One is that it changed the economics. When the internet first started becoming a viable, I mean, the internet's been around like way before it was viable and usable by the masses. Um, it took a while for it to become a stable entity in the communication world. But as the internet took off, more and more advertising dollars went into the internet and the web and not to print, because that seemed to be, and it continues to be, where the statistics show the growth. And when that happened, a lot of publications went by the wayside. They they closed, like U.S. News and World Report that I worked for. So the dynamics changed. So photographers that were regularly working for print publications now found themselves working for organizations, news organizations, or communication arms that were largely published online. So the economics was one portion. I don't think it changed that dramatically for a lot of people, including myself. I don't make different photographs because they're going to be online or because they're going to be in a magazine. My approach is still the same. I think that one big thing that happened when there was a downsizing in print publications was that we shot film for magazines or for newspapers or whatever our print vehicle was. And so the editors would see the entire roll of film, or the entire, like, whatever, 5, 10, whatever, however many rolls of film you shot. They would see everything. I think now what has changed is that people are editing more tightly at home in their home offices, and not, you're sending less, you're opening yourself up less. I think that's not good. I think that some of these picture editors are just incredible, and sometimes the photographer's too close to their work. They don't see things. Other people can actually be of benefit. You have to turn your ego off and accept some of these ideas and critiques from other people, and you miss that in that transition. Getting back to your question, I think that camaraderie and that input from editors was lessened with the digital age, because they weren't seeing the way the photographer was thinking from beginning to end. They were just seeing what the photographer thought was the cream of the crop. It made showing your portfolio easier. I mean, with film, you had to send out a sheet of slides or 2 sheets of slides, transparencies. There was a cost involved in that. You had to go to a photo lab and put it in FedEx and get it out there. Now I can send you a picture in 2 seconds and 20 pictures in 2 seconds. So that was a big change. I can communicate with others. I did a lot of political work following presidential candidates as they were campaigning for the US presidency. And every campaign cycle, it seemed like a major technological breakthrough not took over, but became part of that campaign and altered it. So our cell phones were around a long time, but they weren't really portable. They were kind of big for a long time, and then they got to a point where you could actually carry them with you, and they got small. And so that changed the dynamic of the way the campaign was communicated, because now writers, radio people, photographers could transmit their content quickly back to New York or DC or wherever the home base was, so that you'd have a more up-to-date look at everything. Pictures were transmitted off of phones, and and as digital became higher quality and bandwidths increased, those campaigns became very fast-moving vehicles for transmitting the message of the day. Whereas before, I covered the failed presidential campaign of Bob Dole in '96. We would send our film, and the deadline was Friday. So if the event happened on Thursday and you got the film to New York or DC by Friday, it was still probably too late because the film had to be processed and it would miss the deadline. So um, there's more of an immediacy. An editor can call back and say, "Hey, do you have anything that looks like this or that?" And you can make that alteration or change or fill that empty space quickly. Not with film. I mean, there was a point where there weren't even film scanners, and then film scanners came out. And it's a slow process. I mean, you grew up in the digital age, so I will say it's better and worse in some ways. I think growing up with film taught you to really think it out right there on the spot because you couldn't fix it in Photoshop. There was no Photoshop, and transparency had to be exposed perfectly. And we didn't have autofocus. Everything was manual focus. So it's a big change, a really big change. You probably are the most talented 15-year-old photographer I've ever seen. Really, you're off to a great start. You're going to have a great career.
I really appreciate that. It's an honor to be able to learn from the best, and to be able to share that. So hearing you say that, it means a lot.
No, that's true, man. That's great.
What does it mean when anyone with a mobile phone can take the sorts of images that only skilled photographers could have attempted even 15 years ago?
Well, with the advent of digital photography in conjunction with cell phone technology, everybody obviously has a phone now, which means everybody has a camera. And so there's a lot more pictures being made. But and God only knows where artificial intelligence is going to go, but you still have to have the ability to communicate a situation visually uh, that is not only evocative and provocative, hopefully, but also informational with no extraneous elements. You still have to have that ability. I don't know enough about AI to know if they can do that, but more importantly, AI can't go into new areas that have not been covered and make real pictures of real situations. I don't know why I got off on AI, probably because I'm really worried about it. But that's made a change. So there's a lot more photographs out there. I think the quality, the bar has been lowered a bit because of the saturation of mediocre imagery that has come from the millions of pictures that are being made with all the amateur photographers out there. That said, I still think the cream rises to the top. The great photographers still are doing great work, and it's unique. It's to me, it's still a breath of fresh air when I see. I'm always inspired by the people I follow on Instagram. I'm happily surprised sometimes, and sometimes I expect to be surprised by great photographers like David Allen Harvey has a great Instagram feed. So it's changed. I think the bar has been lowered. I think that there are. I remember Time magazine at one point they published their first cover that was shot on an iPhone, and that's fine. But they looked at it as some big victory. I think the victory is just having a great picture, not what camera it's shot on. That you still need to have. It's still up here. It's not what kind of camera you have. It's not what kind of lens you have. It doesn't matter. You can make great pictures on a plastic Diana camera. You can make great pictures on film. You can make great pictures on literally any camera, including an iPhone or an Android. And it still has to come up to the level and the bar that those in the industry created long ago as being well executed. I don't know.
What are your thoughts on the rise of AI and image manipulation? And what do you think this means for the industry?
When I started out, we would be probably fired from the newspaper if we set up or manipulated a photograph and created something that wasn't real. Um, when I got out of journalism school, I was afraid to take a cup of coffee from somebody on an assignment because the rule of thumb was if you take something from somebody, then you owe them. And if you don't take anything, you're more neutral. I've since learned that taking that cup of coffee is a smart thing to do because it opens the door to a friend, a relationship that fosters that pathway to where you want to get to be able to shoot real intimate pictures that communicate more than the surface of running in and running out of a situation. Um, so AI has taken that to a whole different extreme. I mean, it's phenomenal. Most people watching this probably already know what AI can do and does, but um, when digital photography came about, there were photographers at newspapers in the United States that were fired. Say they had shot a picture with 4 birds on a pond. I'm just making this up, and they thought three birds made a better picture. They'd take 1 bird out. They would get fired for that. It's been a while since I worked for a newspaper, but I would assume that there would be harsh consequences for such activity today. But now along comes AI. AI has a place probably. It's so new to the game. It needs to be regulated. It's scary. I think it's scarier for advertising photographers because advertising by and large is not photojournalism. Obviously, they have more leeway to create. Now I want to say fake thing, but they have more leeway to create a situation than to find it and capture it. So I think artificial intelligence will be a huge benefit to the advertising world not in terms of making better pictures, but in terms of saving the advertisers a lot of money in the process. A lot of these budgets for a picture are huge. $150,000 to put together a photograph because of the crew and the location and the travel and the exorbitant rates of everybody involved in the process. I don't think that AI is going to affect real journalism as much as advertising because you still have to be there. You still have, I mean, capturing the real thing. If some crazy event happens in Pittsburgh, where I live, tomorrow, you can't ask AI to recreate that. I guess you could, but then your publication's not going to be trusted in the future. So I still think there's a great need and a great place and a great home for photojournalists who, like myself and many others, that are trying to capture real, honest pictures.
I think image manipulation is so built into a younger generation. I know I'm certainly guilty of it. So I find that really interesting that you'd be fired if you even slightly manipulated an image.
Sure. Well, the irony of that is that every time you point your camera at something, you're just seeing this much. So what is the truth? What's right over here that's not in the frame, or what's right over here that's not in the frame? So as much as I talk about honesty and integrity with photography, you're only seeing that. So even a real honest picture has the potential to lie. There could be a naked person right here, or whatever, all kinds of weird things that are just out of the frame. So the mere fact that you've decided just to shoot this creates a potentially misleading picture. We can just do our best with the honesty thing. I think in our heart of hearts, we know what's honest. We have to believe in that and follow that path. But in the end, they're really, unless you had a moving video that was, I think, panning left to right, you're really not getting an honest view, a totally honest view of what is happening in any given situation. So you can pontificate the reality of realism, but then again, what's just beyond that frame? I don't, it's a long conversation. I think that I'm glad you brought it up. AI, I think, is the most concerning aspect of photography for me today. Worried about it, but it's the cat is out of the bag or out of the cage and running loose. So we'll see where it takes us.
You said it yourself, there's so much mediocrity in such a saturated market. So how do you think someone starting as any kind of photographer today can learn their trade and earn a living?
It's a great question. Unfortunately, it's much tougher to look to earn a living with photography today. I think that artificial intelligence will increase that difficulty, unfortunately. So when I got out of college, there were tons of newspapers and a lot of really great newspapers. And it was a great training ground for photographers to make some money and make a lot of mistakes and learn from their mistakes. So uh, those jobs, those hundreds and hundreds of newspapers have folded for economic reasons. That's a lot of jobs for young people like yourself coming out of school that need a training ground and a place to make some money and not get fired the next day for making a mistake. That's a benefit of newspapers. They still hire you back the next day, even if you make a mistake, unless it's a extremely unethical mistake. So it's much harder. There's fewer magazines. It's which so the dilemma is, how do you make a living? I think you more than ever, you need to be one of the best. You need to really, really study the art and craft and the vehicle, and you need to learn and work and work and work. Just work as hard as you can, paying attention. Because if you're not one of the best, you're not going to make it. I think that 20 years ago, when there were many more newspapers around and many more magazines, there were more opportunities, and that means there were more opportunities to make a living for all these people. So I think the window's closing. AI is going to close that window more, but the old adage that when one door closes, another one opens. I really feel that there ultimately will become a balance between the real life situation of the artificial intelligence, the loss of jobs. People are recreating different ways to make income on the internet with photography. There's some really great podcasts out there like yours, that talk about it, explain it, and help teach, and they do it with photography. So that becomes an outlet. That becomes what you're creating is in fact a publication. It's a digital publication. So, and what you're doing right now couldn't have been done 20 years ago. So, with that in mind, that's an example of how things morph and change, and a new door opening, so to speak.
What advice would you give to someone living in a small town who wants to go to New York or Washington where there's more action?
Well, first of all, I don't necessarily agree with that assessment that action, I learned and you've learned, let me just rephrase this. So there's great stories right in your backyard. I mean, truly, it's just, you got to stop, research, meet people, talk to people. There's tons of great stories right down the street from where you live. Everybody, every single person. For instance, right within 15, 20 miles of where I live, they're doing a lot of fracking of natural gas. And I have a personal project that's been going on for 10 years. It's right here. I can go jump into that project whenever I want. I can't find that story in Washington, D.C. or New York. And it's a much more meaningful story. It's a much more exciting story. I'm going to give you some other examples of stories, things that I've done right here that I probably would have a difficult time doing somewhere else. Immigration has been a big issue all over the country, especially with the Mexican border in the United States. So I have been working on a project where I met an immigrant family I met them the moment they arrived in Pittsburgh. The moment they got off the plane, I was there and watched their lives change and unfold into a new country, a new place, and what that involved. And they learned how to open a front door. They've never had a lock on a door. They lived in a hut, kind of in a migrant camp for years. They never had electricity. They never had indoor play. So all these things were kind of new, and then they kind of adapted. So it would be hard to do that in a bigger city. You could do it. Another story I did with a group of people was on air pollution. But there's ways to do that more easily in a small town than a large town. It seems like you can make a more cohesive statement when you can take a broad story and bring it down to a focused point. Anyway, I think that it's great to travel. You see new things, but your own backyard is one of the most wonderful places to discover and to rediscover and to keep your eyes open. And if you read the newspaper every day or check the local news, you'll find many, many, many stories that are just, and the more time you spend with those stories, the more they are like an onion. You're just peeling back the layers and discovering new things inside. So how do you get to those? I mean, if your question is how do you get to travel, I would say if it's really traveling is really something you just got to do, then do it frugally. I mean, my first trip to Europe, I got a rail pass and just rode around the country and slept on the train at night, so I wouldn't have to get a hotel, and I would stay in youth hostels, and all those things still exist in different ways. You can do it very inexpensively. And if you can find an assignment, you can make a little money at the same time. So I would just look around your backyard. I think that's a great place to start. And when I say backyard, I mean, like a 20-mile radius of where you live.
You've photographed many presidents and political figures. What's it like travelling with politicians like John McCain and Bush?
It's just like people in general. Every politician is uniquely different. Some you kind of jive with, just like people in your real life. Some have like a security around them that make it hard to penetrate their inner circle or to get telling photographs. But the best thing about traveling in those situations is that you're traveling with some really, really great photographers. And I love that. I love the camaraderie of those people, but I really love the tacit kind competition that you want to do better than everybody else, and they want to do better than you, but it fosters your creative thinking process. It's really great. And I think that process of watching what they do sometimes and seeing how they outshot you, or maybe you got lucky and outshot them, it betters you as a photographer. In terms of the candidates themselves, some people you get to know really well. I got to know John McCain extremely well. Went to a party at his ranch after the campaign was over. Got a nice email from his wife, and there was just a great give and take. Everybody I followed as a candidate has been an incredible experience. When I first followed the younger Bush during his first campaign for president, obviously he wasn't president yet, and so he was more accessible. And when he became president, the Secret Service moves in a more tight fashion. So I've got a picture of him all alone on the campaign plane, eating popcorn by himself, or joking around with his close advisor, Karen Hughes. Pictures like that, I think, after he became president, might have been only accessible by his personal photographer, not the traveling media. But it teaches you ways to think smarter, to think in a more collective way that helps you get intriguing pictures. It's a nice process, and I relish those years. They were, I still do it. I still do a little bit of that, but the long campaigns have been, they're not covered as much by the national magazines anymore, and that's a result of what we talked about earlier about budgets changing, and they can't afford. I mean, the photographers were funded. We had to pay the campaigns for each leg of the flight. It gets back to that ethics conversation we had, where if they were paying for your flight, then maybe you owed them something. But all the news organizations paid for all the travel, paid for the hotels you'd stay in each leg of the way, and the cost became astronomical. I mean, it could be $10,000 a day just to have a photographer flying along with a presidential candidate, and $10,000 times 100 adds up pretty fast.
How different do you think political photography is now compared with the past?
Just like everything else, I know when I started out, I made a lot of mistakes, and I learned from those mistakes. So now when I'm in those situations or where there's a group of photographers competing against me, I'm a little more at ease because I know how things work. I know what you can get away with and what you can't get away with. I know how not to step on any toes to upset anybody. Um, who to meet and greet to kind of maybe help you get to the next step or get into an area. I found out that on Capitol Hill, just by simply wearing a coat and a tie and dressing like the politicians, um, you can get into places that um, some of the other photographers who are not as well dressed by choice can't get in. I went into a super high level um, meeting with John McCain over campaign finance reform. And I probably shouldn't have been in there, but I just walked in with a small Leica tucked under my armpit, I guess. And there I was in the middle of the meeting. And nobody really looked at me. And the Leica at that point was the quietest camera on the market. Now we have mirrorless digital cameras that are silent. Um, and I was able to make some frames at close range. So, I learned that approach from my good friend Stephen Crowley, who always has all the tricks of the trade packed in his mind when he goes out. He's done it a long time, and he's done it much more often than I have, and he's really great at it. He was so kind to teach me uh, the lay of the land and all the nooks and crannies of Capitol Hill at one point, and I'm indebted to him for a lot of different things. But the way it's changed, I think there are more news organizations. 24 years ago or 25 years ago, Getty Images didn't exist like it does today. And now it's a viable entity out there. And you had the Associated Press, UPI, it's called United Press International, um, Agence France Presse, and Reuters, and that was about it. Now you have Politico, you have multitudes of other organizations that are in there competing for space around the candidate. And now news organizations implant young college graduates that are there every day with a video camera, hoping to record something beneficial for their campaign and maybe something detrimental to be used as opposition material. So there's more people. That's how political photography's changed. There's just more news organizations, and that's a result of the digital age, because a lot of these organizations like Axios and whatever, they were all born in the digital age. All of the old standards are still there, the New York Times. But then even the New York Times, they may have had one photographer and one writer on a presidential campaign. Now they have a lot of different combinations of video people and photographers and writers, and it's a fast moving machine. Well, they have to get the information back. They may have editors in different places to push the process along. So the field's it's more crowded, but there's still a way to rise to a level that you're happy with, hopefully.
On a project called Illegal, you get this amazing unseen perspective in a life that most of us will never get to see. Can you tell me more about that?
Yeah, so Illegal, it was shot along the US-Mexican border, and I hung out with some Border Patrol agents. And it was one of the reasons I became a photographer. It was I mean, part of our pay are the experiences we have. We get to have the most amazing experiences, like hanging out on the US Mexican border, waiting for illegal immigrants to cross the border and then figuring out ways to apprehend them. I mean, I'll take that over more pay any day. That's just a fascinating experience. Um, Sleeping out there in the desert. Um, so basically, I was allowed to hang out, embed myself with these border patrol agents for a couple of days as they went about their business. And I learned things like they would look at a path and they would remember the shoe prints. And they would say, well, we saw this shoe print back there. We know that same person's come here. They would sometimes sweep a road clean so they could see who's coming over it. All these little techniques they would use they used infrared cameras at night. Um, uh, and then they also used helicopters where they could go into very remote areas, um, and these helicopter pilots were just amazing. They could spot people that were hiding in underbrush, which to me was almost invisible. They'd see one little telltale sign of a footprints across the road from the air, and then they would know, well, it's probably around here, and we'd land the helicopter, and sure enough, you'd find some people there. But the experience was just phenomenal. Um, the saddest part of the whole process was learning firsthand that most of these people coming across the border, I mean, 99% of them are really good people. They're not rapists and murderers and thugs, and they're people seeking a better life. Um, and it's not well regulated. Clearly, there's still a problem. Um, but it opened my eyes to the fact that these people, by and large, are not to be feared. I think we need to figure out a way to work with the Mexican government, maybe help them out a little bit, so that it's a two-state solution. Um, but it was a great experience, and one thing I liked about it was I didn't have to uh, get names of the people I was photographing. It was legal to photograph them and not get permission or releases signed. I'm not sure exactly how that legal process works, but it was beneficial to the project. It was one of the more fascinating experiences I've had, riding in those helicopters and riding along those dusty roads and being out there at night, seeing these people traverse the desert with infrared cameras and watching from towers as they would pick up animals. Everything that was warm would show up light. It was just a phenomenal process.
Do you struggle maintaining a professional distance from what you're covering, especially when you have a particular view or connections to the subject?
That's a good question. I don't struggle when I'm working. When I'm working, I try really, really hard to be neutral. Everybody has political beliefs, and it's really important to not bring those political beliefs to the assignment. It's our job to communicate what's happening, and the only way to communicate what's happening is just do your best to see both sides. Not all photographers do that. You can see that they take a side. 1 year ago yesterday, the Supreme Court ruled that Roe versus Wade, which shot down abortion, happened, and it was important for me to photograph the people holding up the newspaper saying, hey, we're shutting down abortions, we're happy, and to show that side, that even though that's not my view, I have to respect that there is a large contingent of people that find that to be their view, and that it needs to be recorded. And I can't just photograph and whatever. I can't photograph my views. So I work really hard, even with politicians I may like less or more. I try to make my coverage neutral. It's critical. It's part of the ethics of journalism, and that may be one thing that artificial intelligence is not able to incorporate. It may not. These are heartfelt feelings that people have, and commitments to a particular uh, political thought process that I think would be hard for artificial intelligence to pick up on. Try to be honest, and honesty takes on different levels and different perspectives. But ultimately, if you breach that ethical contract you have with yourself and the public, I think that you'll be found out, and that your ability to move forward and communicate in that arena is diminished. At least people may not hire you. They may not believe you. So there is a process where it's imperative to report the truth the best you can, but it's also that same process may keep your livelihood going, but it may help you continue to make a living or not make a living if people don't trust you. So it's a conundrum, it's something that's going to it's going to be reworked and rewired as artificial intelligence continues to grow.
With such a successful career, is there anything you would change in hindsight?
Yeah, I think well, at a newspaper, you sometimes do 3 or 4 assignments a day, and it's a bit much. But that's just the reality of newspapers. What it taught me was to think quickly, to assess the situation well, to not waste time. Um, if I could do anything differently, some of those things I photographed really needed more time. If I did it again, I would go back on my off time, and I would delve into some of those stories more deeply and give them the communication space I felt they needed and didn't and couldn't do within the 2-hour time slot. Um, and I think I would have spent more time documenting my family. I did document my family a lot, but I mean, look, life is short, and you can't go back and shoot something that happened in the past. So I recommend to everybody to photograph their family, photograph friends, things that are really close to you, really meaningful. Um, those are probably the things I wish I would probably change um, more if I had to go back and do things again. Um, yeah, I mean, I think each individual assignment, as I go back and look at a body of work from, say, a National Geographic traveler story, or I did a story for their Yellow magazine. I look at those situations and I think, wow, you really could have delved into this more deeply, and you could have pursued this angle, because you see in retrospect, as you get better as a photographer, you learn more approaches that would help you out. So, uh, you know, that's hindsight, and you don't have hindsight until you have more history and more mistakes behind you. So, just part of the process.
What motivates you, and what advice would you give to any young or old aspiring photographers listening to this podcast?
I would say, you need to be extremely passionate about it. I still absolutely love photography. I just love it. I started in high school. Right, my first summer after high school. Well, in high school, I was working for the student newspaper and the student yearbook, making awful pictures, but making a lot of mistakes at a very young age. Um, and then after my senior year, that summer, I worked in a factory in Marion, Indiana, sanding Corvette body parts, which are made out of fiberglass, sanding them on an assembly line. And after work, I had a project called Washington Street. It was the only street in my small town that went from one end to the other. And I would walk up and down Washington Street. I would get out of the factory at 5 o'clock and just start walking. And it was my saving grace that summer. It was a horrible, miserable, sweaty job with little fiberglass particles inside of my clothes. But it's that project that got me going in photojournalism. And I look back at that project, and it was, I think, told me that I was going to probably pursue this as a career. I didn't admit it to myself, but I just loved it so much. So what I would tell young people is, if you're not really passionate about it, keep it as a hobby, because you need to not only be passionate and have a drive to be one of the best, or you probably won't make it because the competition is too stiff. You'll make it at some level, but it might be hard to make a living at it. So I would say, shoot a ton. The beauty of digital, or one of the beauties of digital, is that you can shoot a lot and it doesn't cost you anymore. When I started out with film, each roll of film was $7 or $8 and the processing was $7 or $8. So one roll of film, you're like at $15 plus the gas it takes and the mileage it takes to go to the photo lab. Photographers today don't have any excuses not to shoot a lot. You're going to make a lot more mistakes and you're going to learn a lot more. That's probably the best advice I can give to anybody, is to push yourself into using a different lens than you're comfortable with, pushing yourself to get involved in communities that you haven't met or been introduced to, make new friends, research, find out what's in the news, figure out a way to tell that story within 10 miles of your home, and follow your passion. Because if you do follow your passion, the money will follow. That is advice that came from my grandmother in Chicago. She said, look, I know you're passionate about photography, and if you follow your passion, the money will follow, and I did. And so I think you really have to absolutely love doing it. That's probably the bottom line. If you love doing it, you will figure out a way to make a living at it. And there's various degrees of making a living today, and it will all work out. It really will. If it comes from your heart, it'll end up well.
Great answer. Now, before we wrap up, what is life like now, and what are your plans for the future?
So I'm still involved in this project, the Immigrant Project. I'm following this family. They've been here 4 years now. They have children, and another project in Cleveland I'm still working on. It's a story on inner city. It's hard to describe it quickly, so I won't try, but it's an inner city story of the cycle of poverty. The fracking story is right 10 miles away. I'm still working on the fracking story. It's an extremely important environmental story. And I'm staying busy with work. I don't have any intention of slowing down. I'm in good shape and blessed with that. So I'm busy. The future just holds more of the same right now. I need to, I think you're constantly trying to get new clients and hang on to the old ones. It's a pleasant struggle. It's a struggle I enjoy, to balance it all out and to keep it all going and make it all work. But by and large, to me, it's the best job in the world. Where else can you travel on Air Force One with the president and go to a desert with the border control? It helps you lead a very rich and full life. This profession of photojournalism is just phenomenal. It's hard to explain it. I remember my brother-in-law asked me one time, he said, do you feel you're well compensated for your job? I think he was shocked at how much I made compared to how much money he made. And I told him it depends upon how you define well compensated, because we're compensated in so many ways with such a rich life.
Thank you so much for doing this.
Yeah.
I really appreciate it.
It's great to meet you. If you ever come to the States, I hope you stop in Pittsburgh, and you're welcome to stay here.
Thanks.
Thanks, man. Take care.
Thank you so much for watching. Next week's episode will be with David Butow, so stay tuned for that. Thank you very much.